In the summer of 1565, the strategic pivot of the Mediterranean, Malta, faced a dire siege by the Ottoman Empire. The relief force in Messina was ready, but held back by bureaucratic and strategic dilemmas. Key points. The strategic paralysis. Philip II's administrative system, designed for caution, took weeks to respond to the crisis. This delay meant that Malta's defenders faced months of relentless attacks. The human cost. Over 6,000 defenders died before the relief force arrived, 67 days after Fort Saint Elmo's fall. This tragic delay questioned the balance between caution and urgency. The ultimate relief. Don Garcia de Toledo finally sailed on September 4th. By September 14th, the relief force landed, ending the siege, but not before immense suffering and loss. Reflect on the harsh realities of command under crisis. Consider the stories of those who waited and those who acted. Visit Malta today, where history's shadows and lessons endure in every stone. June 23, 1565. The harbor of Messina, Sicily, midday. The sun on the Strait of Messina in late June is the sun of the deep Mediterranean summer. White, vertical, the kind of light that turns the water the color of hammered tin and makes the ships at anchor seem to float in something thicker than water, something that holds them in place more firmly than their anchors alone. In the harbor of Messina that June afternoon, those ships were real and counted. Galleys, transports, supply vessels assembled from the ports of the Spanish Empire over the previous weeks, flying the flags of the most powerful monarchy in Christendom, waiting for orders that had not come. On the deck of one of those galleys, Don Garcia de Toledo, Viceroy of Sicily, Commander-designate of the relief force for Malta, 53 years old and carrying the specific weight of a man who knows exactly what is happening and cannot stop it, read a letter from the island fortress he was supposed to be sailing to save. The letter had come through the usual route, a swimmer, in the darkness, from the fortifications of Birgu across 800 meters of harbor water to the small boats waiting at Calcara Bay, then north by fast vessel to Sicily, arriving in Messina thin with the handling and salt-stained from the sea crossing, but legible enough. It was from Jean de la Valette, Grand Master of the Order of St. John. It described the condition of Fort Saint Elmo in the specific language of a man who has been counting his dead and his powder and his remaining walls, and who does not distort arithmetic for the comfort of his reader. It said, "The fort will fall within days. We need you now." Don Garcia read it. He set it down. He did not sail. 240 miles to the south, Fort Saint Elmo fell on June 23rd, the same day the letter arrived. 500 men, including 69 knights of the order, died in the rubble they had defended for 31 days against 40,000 Ottoman soldiers. 6,000 Ottoman dead lay outside the walls. The fort was gone. And in Messina, the relief force waited. It would wait for 77 more days. This is the story that the Great Siege of Malta almost never tells. The story of the shore, not the walls. The story of the fleet that assembled in the harbor of Messina through the burning summer of 1565. Of the generals and the king and the messengers and the arguments and the paralysis that held 8,000 soldiers in Sicily while the men on Malta died by the week. It is the story of the bureaucratic and political machinery of the most powerful empire in the Western world grinding against the most urgent military crisis of the 16th century, and of the specific human beings at the center of that machinery who understood what was at stake and could not move as fast as the stakes required. Don Garcia de Toledo did not fail at Malta. He arrived. He helped save the island. But he arrived 67 days after Fort Saint Elmo fell, and the question of what those 67 days cost, in lives, in suffering, in the specific moral weight that falls on men who could have gone sooner and did not, is the question that the relief force's story cannot avoid. The island held. but the price of the holding was paid in Birgu and Senglea. The price of the delay was paid on the walls. The machinery of empire and its hesitation. To understand why the most powerful military empire in the Western world spent 77 days deciding whether to save a fortress it had promised to save, you have to understand what the Spanish Empire was in 1565, not as an abstraction, but as a functioning administrative organism with specific capabilities and specific incapacities, specific interests and specific fears, specific mechanisms for making decisions, and specific ways those mechanisms could fail. Philip II of Spain was the most powerful monarch in Christendom. His empire included Spain itself, the southern Italian kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, the Duchy of Milan, the Netherlands, Portugal's Atlantic trade empire, and the entirety of the Spanish Americas, more territory than any ruler since the Roman emperors had commanded, and a revenue stream from the silver mines of Peru and Mexico that was financing not just the Spanish military, but the entire financial architecture of Catholic Europe. He was also the Knights' overlord under the Malta Grant, the secular authority whose obligation to the order was explicit and contractual and had been ratified in 1530 when Charles V gave them the island. He was also, in the summer of 1565, a man managing 5 simultaneous military commitments that each individually required his full attention. The Ottoman Empire was pressing against his Italian possessions and his North African garrisons. The Protestant revolt in the Netherlands was moving toward the open warfare that would consume that province for 80 years. The corsairs of the Barbary coast were raiding his coasts and taking his subjects into slavery at a rate that his navy could not adequately suppress. His treasury was overstretched, despite the American silver, because the costs of empire kept pace with and occasionally exceeded its revenues. And now, Malta. Philip's response to the siege was not indifference. He understood what Malta meant strategically. It was the central Mediterranean's pivot point, the position from which the Ottoman fleet could or could not threaten Sicily and Naples and the Italian coast. He understood what the loss of Malta would mean, an Ottoman base in the center of the sea, from which the empire's European possessions could be hit from the south at will, from which the corsair trade could be expanded to strangle Spanish commerce in the Mediterranean, from which Constantinople could project power westward in ways that would have been impossible without the island. He did not want Malta to fall, but Philip II governed through an administrative system that was designed for continuity and caution rather than for speed. His council system, the various consejos that managed different aspects of imperial administration, processed information, generated recommendations, circulated documents for comment and approval at every level of the hierarchy, and produced decisions that were thorough and considered and occasionally weeks behind the event they were responding to. In ordinary times, this system worked well enough. In the summer of 1565, it was catastrophically mismatched with the speed at which people were dying on Malta. The documents that passed through this system in the summer of 1565, the dispatches from Don Garcia to the Council of War, the Council of War's recommendations to Philip, Philip's responses to those recommendations, the instructions that flowed back from Madrid to Messina through the same channels that had carried the original reports, are preserved in the archives of Simancas in Spain, and reading them produces the specific discomfort of watching a very large and very capable organization process an emergency at a speed calibrated for administration rather than for crisis. The quality of the analysis is often high. The conclusions are often correct. The timing is consistently inadequate. Philip was reading these documents at El Escorial, the monastery palace outside Madrid that was his primary residence, and making decisions in the specific manner of a ruler who understood that the decisions he made about Malta were also decisions about every other commitment of the Spanish Empire simultaneously. Malta was not the only crisis. It was not even the most immediately pressing crisis in the first weeks of the siege, when the Ottoman army had just landed and the fortifications were intact, and the strategic analysis said that a well-prepared garrison in strong positions had reasonable prospects of holding for the season. It was the crisis that became most pressing as the summer progressed, and the dispatches described the progressive deterioration of those positions, and the pressure from Rome, and from the order, and from Don Garcia's own increasingly urgent assessments shifted the calculation. The specific instruction that shaped Don Garcia de Toledo's conduct throughout the siege was an instruction that Philip gave before the siege began, in the form of a standing order to his Sicilian viceroy: "Do not risk the fleet." The Spanish Mediterranean fleet was one of the most expensive and strategically critical assets of the Spanish Empire. Its galleys were not simply weapons. They were the projection of Spanish power across the entire central and western Mediterranean, the insurance against Ottoman naval dominance, the instrument through which Sicily and Naples and the Italian coast were kept defensible. To lose it in a relief operation that failed would be to leave the entire Italian theater of the Spanish Empire exposed to Ottoman action at the moment of maximum Ottoman military presence in the Western Sea. Don Garcia understood this order. He had helped formulate it. He was not a man without military experience or strategic understanding. He was a veteran commander who had spent his career in the naval and land warfare of the Spanish Mediterranean frontier, who had fought the Ottomans before and who understood their capabilities with the precision of direct experience. He knew what the fleet meant to Spanish security. He also knew what Malta meant. The summer of 1565 was the summer he spent holding both of those knowledges simultaneously, trying to find the place where they intersected, and finding it 77 days later than anyone on Malta would have chosen. The man he was watching and waiting for, at the other end of the dispatches, was La Valette. Jean de La Valette, at 69, was the product of 50 years of service to the Order of St. John, a knight since he was young, a veteran of Rhodes, and of decades of Mediterranean operations, a galley slave for a year, and a Grand Master since 1557. He had been preparing for the siege of Malta since before it was announced, had built the fortifications and stocked the magazines and trained the garrison and contaminated the wells and burned the grain, and done everything that could be done by a man who understood that the island would be attacked and who could not know exactly when. When the attack came, he managed the defense with the cold-blooded precision of a man who had thought through every phase of it years in advance. He also managed the political campaign to get the relief force to move. La Valette's letters from the siege to Don Garcia, to the Pope, to Philip II, to the Duke of Savoy, to the Order's representatives in Rome and in Spain. These letters, preserved in archives in Malta and Spain and Rome, are among the most remarkable documents of the 16th century, not because they are dramatic in the literary sense, but because they are precise in the administrative sense, because they describe the military situation with an accuracy that subsequent events confirmed in every detail, and because they press, always press, in every letter with unfailing consistency and unfailing courtesy and absolutely unrelenting insistence for the relief force to move now, immediately, before the situation that La Valette describes with such precision becomes the situation that cannot be recovered. The Pope heard him. Pius IV pressed Philip through every channel available to the papacy: direct appeal, diplomatic pressure, public exhortation, the threat of ecclesiastical displeasure directed at the most Catholic of monarchies. The Pope was not without influence over Philip, but the influence operated through the same administrative system that was already processing everything else, and it arrived at Don Garcia's desk in the form of additional urgency rather than additional clarity about the order that was holding him in Messina. The order itself pressed. The knights who were not on Malta and who were in Rome and in Spain and in France and in every European court where the order maintained a presence, spent the summer of 1565 in a state of organized fury, pressing every available contact for faster action. They were men who understood what the siege meant, who knew that their brothers were dying on the walls of Birgu and Senglea, and who could not reach them because the relief force was not moving, and who used that understanding as fuel for a diplomatic campaign of extraordinary intensity. It was not enough to move the fleet until Don Garcia decided it was enough. Sicily, the fleet, and the weight of caution. Messina in the summer of 1565 was the staging point for everything the Spanish Empire was assembling in response to the Malta siege, and the city's harbor in June and July reflected both the genuine effort being made and the genuine inadequacy of its pace. Ships arrived, troops were quartered in the city's warehouses and convents, supplies accumulated. The organizational machinery of a 16th-century military expedition ground through its necessary stages: the muster rolls, the provisioning contracts, the coordination between the various national contingents that Philip's empire could draw on, the arrangements for cavalry horses and pack animals and medical staff, and the 1,000 other requirements of an army that had to cross the sea and fight at the end of the crossing. It was real work, and it took real time. Don Garcia was not idle in Messina. He was doing what a commander in his position did, building the force that he would need, assembling it under conditions of genuine logistical complexity, managing the competing priorities and the competing egos of the Spanish and Italian and Sicilian officers, who each brought their contingents with specific expectations about command authority and operational precedence. An army assembled from the various components of the Spanish Mediterranean Empire was not a single coherent force on the day of assembly. It became one through the specific work of staff officers and supply officers and the commander's own authority over weeks of preparation. The terrain that the relief force would have to cross was also genuinely difficult in the specific way that amphibious operations were difficult in the 16th century. The island of Malta was 240 miles from Messina, a sea crossing of 20 to 40 hours, depending on wind and weather, through waters that the Ottoman fleet was actively patrolling and whose western approaches were covered by Ottoman naval observation posts on the Sicilian coast and in the waters between Sicily and Malta. Landing a force on an island that was occupied by 40,000 Ottoman soldiers with 200 galleys available to intercept was not simply a matter of putting men in boats and sailing south. It required the specific operational conditions: favorable weather, Ottoman fleet distracted or positioned away from the landing site, coordination with the defenders inside Malta to ensure the landing force was not isolated on the beach. That took time to arrange, and that Don Garcia was trying to arrange, while simultaneously explaining to every messenger from the Pope and the Order and La Valette why the arrangement was not yet complete. The sea route to Malta in 1565 ran through waters that both sides were watching. The Ottoman fleet under Piale Pasha had 200 galleys in the Grand Harbor and Marsamucetto when the siege began, and detachments from that fleet periodically swept the approaches to the island, looking for exactly the kind of relief force that Don Garcia was assembling in Messina. The Spanish intelligence service, which was extensive and generally well-informed in the Mediterranean theater, provided Don Garcia with regular reports on Piale's fleet positions and movements, and those reports were a significant input into the timing calculations that were governing the relief operation. The force that was eventually assembled numbered approximately 8,000 men. They represented the combined contribution of various Spanish, Italian, and Sicilian contingents: Spanish infantry veterans of the Italian wars, Sicilian infantry raised locally, knights and men-at-arms from the various nationalities that the Spanish Empire commanded in southern Italy. The commander designated for the ground force, the man who would lead the troops once they landed, was Ascanio della Cornia, an Italian condottiere with a record of competent professional service. Don Garcia would command from the fleet. The force also included, on paper, contingents that had been promised from various quarters, but that arrived slowly or not at all, from Genoa, from the Pope, from various Italian states whose interest in Malta's survival was real, but whose ability to mobilize rapidly was limited by the same administrative inertia that was affecting the Spanish imperial machinery. The final assembled force was smaller than what La Valette had been requesting, and smaller than what the strategic analysis of the situation suggested was ideal. But it was real, and it was in Messina, and by August it was ready to sail. The specific experience of the 8,000 men waiting in Messina through June and July and August of 1565 has no chronicle to itself, no account written from inside the force's experience of the delay. But its broad outline is recoverable from what military waiting always produces: boredom compounding into frustration, frustration compounding into the specific anger that soldiers develop toward the bureaucratic machinery that holds them in place while a battle proceeds without them. The Spanish infantry who had been quartered in Messina's warehouses since June had heard the dispatches, or enough of them to know the shape of the situation. They knew that men were dying on Malta. They knew they were supposed to go there, and that they were not going there. The reasons for this, the strategic calculation, the fleet safety instruction, the operational conditions, filtered down from command in the form of assurances that the departure date was near, and those assurances were amended as the departure date was revised. Soldiers in this condition are not simply waiting, they are performing the specific psychological labor of maintaining readiness, of keeping themselves sharp and prepared and willing to fight, in conditions that do not require fighting and that make the maintenance of readiness effortful without reward. By August, the force in Messina had been waiting for the better part of 2 months, and what 2 months of waiting does to men who were recruited for a fight is the thing that military historians tend to understate because it does not produce dramatic narrative. It produces attrition. Not the physical attrition of combat, but the psychological attrition of men whose purpose has been suspended and whose energy has no adequate outlet. It did not sail in July. It did not sail in early August. Don Garcia held. The specific reasoning that governed each delay is preserved in the dispatches and letters of the period, and reconstructing it is the work of historians who have spent careers parsing the administrative records of the Spanish imperial system. The sequence of reasoning ran approximately as follows. The Ottoman fleet was too present in the approaches to Malta in late June and early July for a landing to be conducted safely. The force was not yet fully assembled in early July. The intelligence on Ottoman fleet positions was not sufficiently clear in mid-July. The weather was unfavorable in late July. The force's provisioning was still being completed in early August. None of these reasons was fabricated. Each one was real. Each one was the kind of consideration that a responsible military commander was right to take seriously. And each one, taken individually and sequentially, added another week to the delay that was killing men on Malta. What Don Garcia was managing, underneath all of the specific operational reasons, was a fundamental tension between two legitimate obligations that could not be simultaneously satisfied. His obligation to Malta, to the order, to the Pope, to the strategic interest of the Spanish Empire in maintaining the central Mediterranean position, said sail now with what you have accept the risk. His obligation to the fleet, to Philip's explicit standing order, to the strategic reality that losing the Spanish Mediterranean fleet in a failed relief operation would leave the Italian theater exposed for years, said wait, build the force, minimize the risk, do not sacrifice the instrument that cannot be replaced in an operation that might fail. He resolved this tension slowly. He resolved it in the direction of caution for longer than anyone in Malta would have chosen. He resolved it in September. La Valette's letters from this period are the letters of a man who understands why the relief has not come, and who cannot accept that understanding as an adequate answer. He writes with the precision of a staff officer describing a tactical situation, and with the urgency of a commander watching his garrison die. He describes the condition of the walls in the specific language of a man who knows that the walls and their defenders are the same resource, that when the walls are reduced to rubble, the men defending them are also reduced, that the arithmetic of the siege is running in one direction, and the speed of that arithmetic is not matched by the speed of the relief. He writes, "Send what you have, send it now. We do not need the full force. Send what is ready." Don Garcia did not send what was ready. He waited for the full force. The night before the Piccolo Soccorso, the small relief, the 700 men who eventually made it through the Ottoman blockade to Malta on July 1st, weeks before the main relief, was a night in Don Garcia's command tent in Messina, when the dispatches from Malta arrived with the specific quality they had been arriving with for 6 weeks. Urgent, precise, describing a situation that was worse than the last dispatch. He had read enough of them to know the terrain of La Valette's prose, as well as the viceroy knew the terrain of his own harbor. He knew what the words meant. He sent 700 men, not 8,000, 700. The selection of the 700 was itself an administrative exercise, the identification of men ready to move on short notice, the assembly of boats capable of the nighttime passage through the Ottoman blockade, the coordination with the Maltese contacts who knew the western coast and the bay at Calcara, where the boats could land and be met by the garrison's small vessels. The operation required a specific kind of careful planning and a specific kind of controlled risk that was different from the risk of the full relief, smaller in scale, more manageable in its exposure to Ottoman interdiction, calibrated to minimize the chance of losing the fleet while providing the garrison with the material and moral support that La Valette had been asking for. 700 men who crossed to Malta in the darkness and slipped past the Ottoman blockade by moving along the western coast of the island in fog, reaching Calcara Bay, being picked up by boats from the Birgu garrison, and arriving in the dawn on July 2nd to the specific relief that relief produces. Not rescue, not salvation, but the concrete proof that the world outside the walls had not forgotten the people inside them. 700 men. They were not enough to change the military equation of the siege, but they were proof that Don Garcia had not forgotten, and they bought the morale that buys the days that buy the time. Among those 700 were 40 Knights of the Order, men who had been in Messina waiting for the full relief to sail, who had been watching the dispatches arrive and had reached the point where waiting was no longer possible, who had volunteered or been selected for the crossing precisely because they were knights, and because Fort Saint Elmo had just fallen, and the order had lost 69 of its brothers in that fort, and the men still living on Malta needed to see the cross of the order arriving on their shores. Those 40 knights crossed the harbor water at dawn and climbed into Birgu, and were received by the garrison with the reception that the garrison's condition made possible. Not the celebration of a rescue, but the acknowledgement of our arrival, the specific meaning that their presence carried about whether they were alone. The remaining 7,300 men waited in Messina. The Summer of Dispatches. The summer of 1565, measured in dispatches, was the longest summer in the administrative history of the Spanish Mediterranean Empire. The dispatches moved in both directions. From Malta to Messina, the swimmer in the harbor dark, the boat in the night, the fast vessel north to Sicily, the letter arriving at Don Garcia's desk in the morning, with the salt still on the leather case. From Messina to Malta, the reply, the assurance, the careful description of the preparations that were proceeding, and the specific impediments that remained, and the date. Always a date, carefully calibrated to be close enough to be credible and far enough to be achievable, by which the main relief force would sail. The men who carried these dispatches deserve their own accounting. The swimmers who crossed the harbor at night from Birgu to the boats waiting at Calcara Bay were volunteers, men who understood that an Ottoman patrol boat finding them in the water meant a death considerably worse than the walls could produce, who stripped off their armor and their weapons and crossed 800 meters of harbor in the darkness, carrying letters sealed in waterproof cases, who crawled out of the water on the far side and ran for the boats and crossed the channel to Sicily and put Lavalette's words in Don Garcia's hands. Some of them made the return crossing, some of them did not. The dispatches they carried described week by week the progressive reduction of the Maltese defensive position. Fort Saint Elmo fell on June 23rd. July brought the massive artillery bombardment of Birgu and Senglea, 112 guns firing simultaneously on July 5th, a display of Ottoman firepower that the defenders described in the language of an act of God rather than an act of war. The ground shaking, the air itself seeming to vibrate with the accumulated concussion of 100 cannons firing in overlapping sequence. July brought the water assault on Senglea on July 15th. 3,000 Ottoman soldiers in 100 boats, stopped by the chain that Lavalette had strung across the western shore, met by the hidden battery that sank 8 ships and 800 men in minutes, a tactical success for the defenders that did nothing to change the broader mathematics of the siege. August brought the assault on the bastion of Castile on August 7th. 8,000 Ottoman soldiers attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. The defenders reduced to 1,500 effective fighters, Lavalette himself climbing to the breach with his last reserve. The dispatch describing that assault reached Don Garcia on approximately August 12th. He read it. He did not sail. The specific quality of these weeks in Messina, the quality of waiting, knowing, reading the dispatches, calculating, assessing, deciding not yet, is the human reality of the relief force's story that the histories of the siege tend to elide in favor of the drama on the walls. Don Garcia was not indifferent. He was not cowardly. He was a man managing a genuine strategic dilemma under a set of constraints. Philip's orders, the fleet's safety, the operational conditions of an amphibious crossing that were real and that could not be wished away. He was also a man who knew that every day he waited was a day that people he was responsible for saving were dying. The messengers from the Pope arrived in July with increasing urgency. The papal legate pressed the relief's necessity in language that left nothing implicit. The order's representatives in Messina pressed with the specific desperation of men who were receiving the same dispatches Don Garcia was receiving, and who had less administrative machinery between them and the emotional reality of those dispatches. The Sicilian nobles who had contributed troops to the relief force pressed because their men were sitting in Messina eating Sicilian food, and Sicilian food costs money, and every week of delay was a week of expense on top of the original commitment. Don Garcia absorbed all of this and did not move. In Malta, Lavalette organized the continuing defense with the specific quality of a man who has accepted the worst case and is making his plans around it. He had told the garrison since the beginning of the siege that the relief would come, had told them this as a fact rather than as a hope, because the relief was real and Philip II had obligations, and Don Garcia had ships, and the relief would come. But the relief had not come, and August had arrived, and the walls were rubble in multiple sections, and the garrison was fewer than 2,000 effective fighters, and the relief had still not come. He did not stop telling them it was coming. He continued saying it as a fact. This was the specific quality of La Valette's command. Not that he believed everything he said, but that he understood that a commander's belief, stated as fact and maintained as fact through every observable indicator that it might not be true, is the foundation on which everything else rests. The garrison was dying. They were dying on walls that were rubble, and La Valette was walking those walls twice daily and telling everyone he saw that the relief was coming. It was coming. It was coming from Messina, at a speed that would, eventually, prove inadequate to prevent the deaths that the delay cost, but sufficient to prevent the deaths that the siege's completion would have cost. Don Garcia sailed on September 4th. The decision to sail, the specific morning on which Don Garcia gave the order that had been waiting for weeks and that was received by his officers with the relief of men who had been waiting for it, was the product of an accumulation that finally exceeded a threshold. The intelligence that the Ottoman fleet was concentrated in the Grand Harbor and Marsamucetto, rather than in the approaches to the island, was clearer than it had been in weeks. The weather was favorable. The force was ready. And something in the dispatches from Malta in late August, the description of the August 7th assault, the scale of the Ottoman effort, the condition of the walls, the stripped-down language in which La Valette described the state of the garrison, had produced in Don Garcia a calculation that the remaining justifications for delay had exhausted their weight. He gave the order. The fleet assembled. The scene in Messina harbor on the morning of September 4th was the scene that 8,000 men had been waiting for since June, the specific organized chaos of a fleet preparing to depart, the embarkation of troops who had been quartered in the city for months, now boarding the galleys and transports with the focused urgency of men who had been waiting and who are now, finally, being allowed to do the thing they came to do. Equipment was loaded. Horses were brought aboard the transport vessels. The commanders went over the plan one more time, landing at Melilla Bay on Malta's northern coast, the force moving south toward the Ottoman siege lines. Don Garcia managing the fleet offshore. The signal codes between the fleet and the landing force were confirmed. The weather reports from the lookouts on the Messina Heights were favorable. The fleet sailed south that evening. 240 miles. The night crossing through the Strait of Sicily, past the Cape of Passero and into the open water between Sicily and Malta. The fleet maintaining its formation in the darkness, and the crews watching the horizon for the Ottoman patrol vessels that had been visible in these waters all summer. They found none. The Ottoman fleet, drawn into the Grand Harbor since the siege's focus had moved to the land operations, had thinned its open water presence in the approaches. The crossing was unopposed. The first light of September 7th showed Malta from the north, the limestone cliffs of the island's coast materializing from the darkness, the hills above Melilla Bay taking shape in the dawn, the specific geography that every man in the fleet had been studying on maps and charts since June, now present in 3 dimensions and actual. The bay was quiet. No Ottoman vessels in the anchorage, no defensive positions on the beach. 8,000 soldiers came off the boats. The landing at Melilla was not a contested beach assault. It was an administrative operation, the organized movement of men and equipment from ships to shore, performed under the direction of the embarkation officers with the specific efficiency of a military force that has had months to rehearse the procedure in its plans, even if not in execution. The boats touched the beach, the ramps went down. The men walked off into the shallow water at the bay's edge and formed up on the sand. The cavalry horses were brought off the transport vessels and assembled. the artillery, the cannons that would be needed if the Ottoman army offered battle, was hauled ashore and limbered. By mid-morning, the force was formed and moving south. Cavalry in the lead, infantry behind, the columns moving through the Maltese landscape toward the siege lines that had been in place for 4 months. The landscape they moved through was the landscape of a country that has been at war all summer. Farms abandoned, wells contaminated, the marks of the Ottoman army's passage visible in the churned roads and the stripped fields, and the occasional burned structure that had not been useful enough to preserve. The soldiers from Messina were moving through evidence of what the siege had meant for the island as a whole, not just for the fortifications they were heading toward. In Birgu, the garrison heard the news by mid-morning. The relief had come. La Valette received the report with the specific quality of a man who has been saying for 4 months that this moment would arrive, and who, in the privacy of the moment, perhaps allows himself to feel how uncertain he had been that it would arrive in time. He had been saying it as fact. He had not known it as fact. The dispatches from Messina had been promising a date and revising the date and promising again, and the dispatches from his own walls had been describing the progressive reduction of the force he was telling would be rescued. He had held both of these things simultaneously, the saying and the knowing, and now the saying had proven true and the knowing could stand down. He sent word to the walls. He ordered the bells rung. The sound of the bells of Birgu on September 7th, 1565, carried across the harbour that had been the arena of the siege since May, across to the ruins of Fort Saint Elmo on its promontory, across to the Ottoman positions on the Corradino Heights, across to the Ottoman camp where Lala Mustafa Pasha was receiving his own reports about the landing at Meliha. The bells were the first thing that had changed in the acoustic signature of the siege in 4 months. They were the signal that the thing La Valette had been saying was true, and the garrison heard them and understood what they meant. Lala Mustafa Pasha received the news of the landing with the calculation of a man who had been expecting it, and who had been told by his scouts that the relief force was smaller than the rumors had suggested. He abandoned the siege and ordered the army to embark. Then his scouts brought him the actual count, 8,000 men, not the tens of thousands the rumors had claimed, and he turned the embarking force around. The engagement at St. Paul's Bay on September 11th ended the siege. The accounting. The harbor of Birgu on September 14th, 1565, was the harbor of a fortress that had survived something it was not supposed to be able to survive. Don Garcia de Toledo came ashore to meet La Valette in person on September 14th, 2 days after the Ottoman fleet had departed and 11 days after his own fleet had landed the relief force. The accounts of that meeting are brief and not dramatic. 2 administrators meeting after a crisis, each understanding what the other had done and what the other had not done. The specific silence between men who have been on opposite sides of a decision that cost lives and that they will spend the rest of their careers parsing. Don Garcia brought food. This was the first thing. The garrison of Birgu and Senglea had been surviving on diminishing rations since July, and the food that the relief fleet carried was the most immediate form of rescue that Don Garcia could offer. He also brought surgeons and supplies for the Order's hospital, and powder for the depleted magazines, and the material proof that the world outside the walls was interested in what the world inside the walls had done, and what it had cost. The cost was being counted in those days. The garrison that had begun the siege in May with approximately 8,000 soldiers, knights, professional soldiers, Maltese militia, volunteers, had by the time of the relief been reduced to fewer than 2,000 effective fighters. More than 6,000 were dead or incapacitated. The Knights of the Order had suffered particularly. Of the approximately 500 knights who had been on Malta when the siege began, roughly 250 had died, half the order's fighting strength in the central Mediterranean theater, eliminated in 4 months. The fortifications were rubble in so many places that rubble was more appropriate than wall as the descriptive term for what had been the defenses of Birgu and Sanglea. Fort Saint Elmo was a ruin on its promontory, the Ottoman guns that had been positioned on its remains cleared away by the relief forces' advance, but the structure itself unrepairable without reconstruction from the foundations. The hospitals were full. The streets of Birgu, where the buildings had not been demolished in the pre-siege preparation, were damaged. The island smelled of 4 months of siege. The Ottoman losses were enormous. The most commonly cited figure is 25,000 dead, with an unknown but substantial number of additional wounded. Against a garrison that had never exceeded 9,000, and that by the end of the siege numbered 2,000, this casualty ratio is among the most extreme in the recorded history of siege warfare. The cost of taking Fort Saint Elmo alone, 6,000 dead against 500 defenders in 31 days, established the pattern that the subsequent 4 months continued. Lavalette's letters to Philip II and to Don Garcia and to the Pope in the weeks after the relief are the letters of a man who has processed the crisis and is now in the reporting phase, the administrative aftermath of an event whose emotional reality he declines to perform for his correspondents. He thanks them for their assistance. He notes the condition of the island. He requests resources for reconstruction. He notes, with the precision that characterized all his correspondence, that the relief arrived 67 days after Fort Saint Elmo fell. He does not say what those 67 days cost in lives. The arithmetic was available to anyone who read the casualty figures. Don Garcia de Toledo returned to Sicily. He had saved Malta. He had saved it later than he could have. He spent the remaining years of his life in the administrative service of the Spanish Empire and died in 1577, 12 years after the siege, having never been formally criticized for the delay and never having fully resolved in his own accounting the question of what the delay cost. The field north of the Grand Harbor, where the Ottoman siege lines had been, fell quiet in the September weeks after the relief. The tents were gone. The batteries had been dismantled. The trenches that the Ottoman engineers had spent 4 months digging across the Maltese limestone were there, raw in the soil, still smelling of the occupation. The bodies of the Ottoman dead, too many to have been moved by the departing army, too many to have been properly buried in the 4 months of the siege, were in the trenches and at the walls and in the water of Sanglea's western shore, where the July water assault had ended. The scent of a very large number of dead men in September heat is the scent that follows battles in summer, and it would follow Malta through the autumn until the rains came and the earth took back what it had been given. Don Garcia sailed north. Lavalette walked his walls. What the delay made and what it did not. The Great Siege of Malta ended with the Ottoman withdrawal on September 12, 1565, and in the weeks that followed, the celebration in Catholic Europe was the celebration of people who had been holding their breath since May and who were exhaling all at once. The Pope declared thanksgiving. Philip II received the news in the specific way that monarchs receive news of military successes they helped delay, with the particular combination of relief and dignity that royal correspondence required, the gratitude expressed in the proportion that suited the occasion. The immediate strategic consequences were the consequences of a preserved position and a destroyed initiative. The Ottoman Empire did not attempt another major Western Mediterranean operation at the same scale in Suleiman's lifetime. The Sultan died in 1566, 1 year after the siege, on campaign in Hungary, and his successors had different strategic priorities. The specific plan that the 1565 campaign represented, a Malta base from which Ottoman naval power could project westward, threatening Sicily and Naples, and potentially the Italian coast, was abandoned as a result of the siege's outcome, not permanently and not absolutely, but effectively for the generation during which such an operation might have been decisive. Lepanto in 1571 was the next major Western Mediterranean naval engagement of scale, and its outcome, the destruction of the Ottoman fleet by the combined forces of the Holy League, was shaped in part by the confidence that had accumulated since Malta, the specific knowledge that Ottoman naval power could be met and damaged on ground the West chose rather than ground the East chose. The longer consequences of the relief force's specific story, the delay, the bureaucratic hesitation, the instructions that held 8,000 men in Sicily while the walls of Birgu were reduced to rubble, were absorbed into the administrative culture of the Spanish Empire in the way that lessons are absorbed when they are expensive enough to be remembered, but not catastrophic enough to force structural reform. Don Garcia de Toledo was not punished. His conduct was criticized privately and defended publicly, in the specific way that conduct in crisis tends to be treated when the crisis ends in success. He had held the fleet safe. He had landed the force. Malta had not fallen. The administrative record showed achievement. What the administrative record did not show, could not show, being by nature quantitative and formal, was the specific quality of the 67 days between Fort Saint Elmo's fall and the relief force's landing. Those 67 days contained the deaths of thousands of people who might not have died if the force had landed sooner, and they contained the survival of thousands more who lived because Don Garcia eventually came, and they contained the specific human experience of men on the walls of Birgu, who were being told the relief was coming, and who could see every day that it had not arrived yet, and who kept fighting anyway. The philosophical question that the relief force's story poses is the one that all delayed rescue stories pose. At what point does caution become complicity? Don Garcia's caution was rational. It was supported by real strategic considerations. It was the kind of caution that a responsible commander exercising his best judgment would have exercised in his position. And it cost lives. Both of these things are simultaneously and uncomplicatedly true, and the discomfort of holding them simultaneously is the moral reality of command in crisis conditions. La Valette began building Valletta on March 28, 1566, on the promontory of Skiberas, the ground where the Ottoman batteries had stood, the ruins of Fort Saint Elmo at its tip. He designed it, with the finest military engineers in Europe, to be the fortress that Malta had needed and had not quite had in 1565. Thick-walled, grid-planned, proper. He named it after himself. It became, in 2 generations, one of the most defensible cities in the Western world. The specific decisions that went into Valletta's design, the wall thicknesses calculated for artillery that did not yet exist, but would exist within 2 decades, the street grid designed to allow rapid infantry movement between threatened points, the position of the magazines and the cisterns and the hospitals relative to the fortifications they served, were the decisions of a man who had spent the summer of 1565 waiting for a relief force, and who had resolved that the next time Malta needed rescue, it would not need it as urgently, because the fortifications would be able to absorb more punishment and hold longer under the kind of bombardment that had reduced Fort Saint Elmo to rubble in 31 days. This was La Valette's answer to the 67 days. He could not change what had happened. He could build something that would make it less likely to happen again. He could take the lesson that the delay had taught and build it in limestone, in the walls of a city that would stand long after he was gone. He did not name anything after Don Garcia de Toledo. He did not need to. Don Garcia had come. That was the obligation, and it was met. And the timing of the meeting was the kind of thing that men in La Valette's position absorb and move past. Because the work of building a city that will not require a relief force is more useful than the work of maintaining a grievance about the relief force that came late. Centuries later, Valletta is the capital of Malta, a small island nation in the center of the Mediterranean. The fort whose fall marked the beginning of the 67 days, Fort Saint Elmo, rebuilt after the siege on stronger foundations, stands at the harbor entrance where it has always stood. Its rebuilt walls, the embodiment of the lesson the original walls paid for in lives and time. The Grand Harbor is full of cruise ships now. The fortifications are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The archives in Valletta contain La Valette's letters, his dispatches, his specific and unfailing request for the relief force to move. They contain Don Garcia's replies as well, the careful dates, the specific impediments, the carefully calibrated nearness of a date that kept receding. Both men were doing what they understood to be right. Both men were carrying constraints that were real. Both men were trying to save an island that was worth saving, by methods that differed in their speed and their cost. The island was saved. The cost was borne by the people on the walls. They bore it for 67 days after Fort Saint Elmo fell. They bore it on walls of rubble and on water rations and on the daily testimony of La Valette walking those walls and telling them what he was telling them. He was right. The relief came. It came when it came, and the walls held until it did. That is the full account of the relief force. The fleet in the harbor that could have sailed sooner, the man on the deck who understood why it had not, and the man on the walls who kept saying it was coming until it was true. The harbor is still there. The dispatches are still in the archives. The walls that were rebuilt are stronger than the ones that nearly failed. And the question of the 67 days is still the question that no administrative record can fully answer.